Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're tuning in from. We're delighted to have you today for our fourth session of the Global Youth Climate Training Program. And today we're going to be speaking about non-state actor involvement in raising ambition in the NDCs. So I'm Alexis McGivern. I am the director on the Oxford side. And today I have with me Myrna moderating with me. So Myrna, over to you to introduce yourself, and then I'll talk about the learning outcomes.
Hi, everybody. I'm Myrna. I'm part of the Global Youth Climate Training team from the Global Youth Coalition side, and I'm excited to see you again. I obviously today's topic is so important. NDCs are so important, and you'd be surprised at how effective how much effect non-state actors have on NDCs and on climate commitments in general. So I'm so excited myself to hear from all the speakers, and over to Alexis for the learning outcomes.
Thanks so much. Fred, if you could get the slides up, that would be fab. And I'll walk us through the main learning outcomes for today. So we've got three amazing speakers with us today, starting with Carly Leung, who's our youth speaker today, calling in from Hong Kong. Then we'll have Youba Sokona, who's the former IPCC vice chair. And then we'll finish off with Kaya Axelsson, who's the head of policy and partnerships at Oxford Net Zero. Oh, sorry, you have been sharing the slides. I'm sorry, Fred. So today our key learning outcomes are, by the end of the session, being able to articulate why and how technical interventions on climate must be accompanied by contextualization and understanding of social preferences and cultural acceptability, being able to explain the intersection between corporate governance and increased ambition in NDCs, evaluate and understand different countries' NDCs, and importantly, be able to know where to go and who to go to for when latest analysis and new NDCs get released starting next year. So as I mentioned, we have an amazing round of speakers today, and we're really delighted to introduce Carly Leung. So Myrna, I'll hand over to you to introduce our first speaker.
Of course. And one quick note before I introduce Carly is that the community note-taking is already in the chat. So for everyone to take notes on what everyone's saying. Now, Carly has an amazing bio. Carly Leung is a member of the UN Asia Pacific Youth Advisory Group on Environmental and Climate Justice, where she actively contributes to the advancement of these critical issues. Carly's passion and expertise extends beyond her advisory role. Recognizing the urgent need for a just climate transition, she co-founded the Climate Incubator. This initiative serves as a dynamic platform for individuals seeking to acquire the necessary skills and knowledge to effectively address climate change. As an incubator that empowers youth, she sets up Climate Incubator to foster collaborative learning, networking, and the development of green skills. We're so excited to hear from you, Carly.
Hi, thank you for the great introduction. Hi, everyone. This is Carly calling from Hong Kong. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you all of you for being here. So to start with, let me share my screen. Okay. Lovely. So before I came here, I actually thought a lot about what to share with the limited time I have. And I decided instead of diving deep into the technical jargon, I would like to share some of my personal experience in engaging with non-state actors and how we can be involved in this process. So when we discuss the involvement of non-state actors in NDCs, it can be very overwhelming because this terms contains a wide range of players, such as private sector, researchers, cities, and civic society. And I often ask myself a question, what is our role? Like, what is my role? And how should we position ourselves in this journey? So to answer that, I would love to share a bit of my journey. So bear with me as I prepare some of my drawings to illustrate my whole experience. So my journey has been quite a roller coaster. I started as a student and then I dive into community projects in places like Uganda and Nepal. And I even launched my first business and then it tanked within a year. But after that, I get back to school for my master degree, and then COVID hits, and then it had the light bulb moments that I realized I want to dive into climate advocacy on the ground, engaging in lobbying, negotiation, and participating in COPs. So that's why it hits me, because I realized my roles are actually keeps evolving. So I've been worn like very different hats. Some of them like students, researcher. Sometimes I can be an entrepreneur, and sometimes I can be an advocate or even a COP delegate. But each experience actually taught me that I could engage with different people across different sectors. So sometimes as a student, you engage with the university, with independent experts, but as a researcher, then you have to talk to the local communities more. Sometimes it can be think tanks and it can be NGOs. And at that time, I didn't recognize these people as long-stay actors because I simply knew that their voice were crucial. So for example, one of the mini project that I had in the past is about food waste recycling issue in Hong Kong. And I have to talk to the government authority, of course, but then also the small to medium-sized enterprise, restaurants, general public, and also think tank, because they have been doing this kind of research for so long. And I kind of treasure their experience a lot, especially I know that how to gather their opinions and then kind of have the meeting with the government. And these voices actually matters. So after talking to countless individuals and then having one project after another, and I figured that my role is to actually inspire people to use their power as a force for good. And of course, having the collaboration to drive system change, no matter if it's policy or culture. So that's why I would like to ask your questions, like all of your questions. What about you? Like, what kind of role that you want to play in this process? Because this question is vital for me, as I believe that our actions should align with our personal missions. So once you identify your role, then let's dig in deeper. So later on, I joined, almost like 2 years ago, I joined the UN APED advisory group, no matter what the title is. My goal has been to make the decision-making process at national, regional, and international levels more inclusive. So I remember my first submission to the UN is focused on business and human rights. And for your information, my background is in psychology. So I don't know much about the legal term. That's why I relied heavily on my fellow human rights lawyers a lot for that submissions. But I'm good at connecting with the community, like talking with different people and stakeholders. So it comes to the core question. It boiled down to one fundamental question for that submission, which is, should a village have a say if a company wants to build a coal plant nearby their house? And my answer is absolutely yes. So we have to dive into what kind of barriers do they have, like how to make sure that these people's voices are being included in the process. Is it because of the culture or the diverse beliefs and practices, or is it because of the finance, the funding, or is it because of the informations? Let alone them. I even myself cannot understand all these big legal terms. So how can the villagers understand that and being involved in that discussion? So we are trying to give suggestions on how to simplify all this legal and bureaucratic language and involve them, all these stakeholders, into the decision-making process. Or if it's something missing, like the framework of reporting their opinion in the policy making process. So there are lists of barriers and it can go on and on and on and on. And we will look at NDCs. It's massive and there must be work needs to be done on the ground. So from the local communities to the global stage, where do you aim to make the waves. So as I reflect on my journey, one thing actually stands out. So it's crucial to design with and for the people, no matter as an entrepreneur or as an advocate. Because if our initiatives don't serve them, then what's the point of having them? So what can we do now? Then we will jump into the action part. So every time when I feel lost, I come to revisit this graph, looking at the opportunity, no matter it's like external or internal, what are the things that we can do as a youth or everyone sitting in this Zoom call. It can have a lot of things that you can build. It can be capacity building or applying your skills and technology, fundraising, and make sure the plans are being implemented and keeping the authority accountable. Because a plan without action is just a plan, and we don't need concepts of plan, and we need action. So as we navigate this adventure of self-discovery and change-making, remember that each of us have a vital role to play. And I know the journey can be very challenging, but it's also very rewarding because take myself as an example, I can never imagine myself studying legal terms in my advocacy journey. So I hope all of you will have that little light bulb moments and with your action aligning with your mission. So I know that my time is kind of running out, but thank you. And thank you for listening. And I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts and experience in the chat box. Thank you so much.
This was amazing. Thank you so much, Carly. And you're so right. It's so important to know your mission and to know like which hat to put on at what time. So thank you so much for your intervention. And if anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat box. I'll hand it over to Alexis now to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks so much. And thank you so much, Carly. That was a really fantastic overview of your life and your work. So thank you so much for being with us today. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Youba Sokona, who is our next speaker. Youba Sokona is a global figure with deep technical knowledge, extensive policy experience, and an unreserved personal commitment to African-led development. He is the former vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, and was elected to this post in October 2015. Prior to this, Youba was co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change for the 5th assessment report after serving as a lead author since 1990. He has over 35 years of experience addressing energy, environment, and sustainable development in Africa, and is therefore a well-known and leading global figure. In addition to these achievements, Youba has a proven track record of organizational leadership and management, for example, as coordinator of the African Climate Policy Center and as executive secretary of the Sahara and the Sahel Observatory. And Youba and I have worked together on a couple of papers, and really, really glad to see him here today. So thank you so much, Youba, and really looking forward to your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen. Greetings from Bamako, Mali. Thank you. I was wondering when Alexis was speaking if it is really me. Let me try to walk you through the non-state actor involvement in increasing ambition in the NDCs. To start with, I think it's important and then to indicate what we mean by non-state actors. And then those that has been already indicated by the previous speaker. But it's important sometimes to repeat what has been already said so that we can get on mind. The non-state actors, including businesses, civil society organizations, indigenous groups, academic institutions, government, non-government, and then they play a crucial role in the national determined contribution. And their involvement in the national determined contributions is vital and then for raising ambition and ensuring that climate commitments are not only aspirational, but also achievable. And sorry for that. And their involvement is essential for a more inclusive, effective, and ambitious climate action framework. Their role also is increasingly recognized in the global climate governance, particularly through platforms like UNFCCC Global Climate Action Agenda, which seeks to integrate non-state actors into the broader climate policy framework. And by providing technical expertise, financial resources, public pressures, and on-the-ground implementation, non-state actors contribute to more effective and comprehensive climate action. And what are the issues to consider? And then in the Global South requires a range of technical intervention and then to tackle climate change tailored to local context and supported by international cooperation and finance. And this intervention can contribute to sustainable development, resilience building, and the overall well-being of communities across these regions. And then these technical interventions aims at addressing climate change and promoting sustainability that must be carefully contextualized within the social and cultural fabrics of the communities where they are implemented to ensure their success and sustainability. And without contextualization, intervention risk failure due to social resistance, cultural conflicts, or exacerbation of existing inequities. By integrating social and cultural consideration, climate intervention can become more inclusive, equitable, and effective, ultimately leading to more resilient and sustainable communities in the Global South. And that explains why this is important. And let us explore some of the technical intervention. This for sure is not exhaustive, but the need for climate to shift development pathway in considering, for instance, the renewable energy deployment. Just look at the solar and wind energy. Those are the only. One can also think of biomass depending on the location, can think on hydro from the micro to mini, the off-grid and mini-grid systems. And then looking at the climate-smart agriculture, so that to look at the drought-resilient crops, the sustainable land management practices, and then there's a wide range of intervention, and then that has been led by most of the civil society organizations, and then we can explore on that. It can also cover the water resource management, and then the rain water harvesting or irrigation efficiency. And then we can think of enhancing irrigation efficiency through the use of drip irrigation, and then sprinkler systems and water efficient crop that can sufficiently reduce water use in the agriculture. One may think also of disaster risk reduction and the resilience building, and particularly actually where we're seeing in many of the Saharan countries a lot of flood. And then that has been devastating, and then since the past 2 to 3 months. And then by thinking of early warning systems, climate resilient infrastructure. One can think also of waste management and circular economy. And this very important issue, particularly in urban area, is a nightmare of many of the measures. And then ways to enter technology, recycling, and resource efficiency. One can think also of urban planning and transportation, and then sustainable urban design, public transport, and electric vehicle. And then this is very important, and then to reduce the mobility in the urban area. Urban planning, transportation, and forest conservation and reforestation, those are also some of the areas where community-based forest management and the restoration of land degradation, and those cover a number of technical issues that need to be considered. And then why the need for contextualization? This is the question we may raise. The cultural acceptability and social preference is very important because of we have to look at the local knowledge and practices. And then the respect for cultural values, they're very important if you want to implement anything, and then to get mobilization of the people and the population, the communities. And then the social equity and inclusivity is very important by addressing social inequities. And then participation and consultation is critical, is fundamental if you want to look at achieving some of the objectives now and in the longer term. And then the sustainability and long-term adoption by changing our behaviors. Most of the things is very important if we manage to change the behavior. And this is very important because individual action, community action are very important. And then the local capacity and knowledge transfer is critical, fundamental. We do not have only to rely on scientific knowledge. The local and the indigenous knowledge are also very important. All the local knowledge systems are critical, fundamental. It's important also to look at the policy and the governance aspect, aligning with local governance structures, building trust and legitimacy. And those are some of the elements of why we need that. And then how now to contextualize the technical intervention. There are a number of issues we need to look at. First, the participatory approaches built on engaged local communities in the planning, design, and implementation phase of the intervention. Participatory approaches ensure the intervention are tailored to local needs and preferences, and that communities have a sense of ownership over the solution. This is critical, fundamental. A second group of elements is the cultural and social assessments. Conduct thorough cultural and social assessments before implementing intervention to see if that will be accepted or not. And then this assessment can identify potential cultural barriers, social preferences, and communities dynamics that should be considered. The third group of elements is the collaboration with local leaders and organizations. That's very important, how to attract the attention of social leaders, and then they could also help mobilizing the people. Work closely with local leaders, NGOs and community organizations who understand the local context and can facilitate communication between external actors and the communities that will help and then to have the acceptability of any kind of intervention we need to bring at the community level. And then the fourth element is capacity building and education. That fundamental, crucial, that provide education and capacity building. Most of the time, it's important to look at first the existing capacity and then to mobilize those capacity. And then when some of the element is missing, then think of capacity building opportunities and then to ensure that communities understand the technical interventions and can adapt them and then to fit their cultural and social context. This approach also helps and then to build local expertise and resilience. Never start with capacity building, start with capacity mobilization. Now, if you realize that the needed capacity does not exist in the community, then think of capacity building. And by way of conclusion, it's very important and then to indicate that the Global South, characterized by diverse culture, social structure, and economic conditions, require that climate solutions are tailored and then to local realities. Most of the time nervous when people said that in Africa, it looked like Africa is a village. It's a continent with a lot of diversity, cultural diversity, social diversity, economic diversity, physical diversity, political diversity. At the same time, there is a number of communalities, and then we can work on, but it's very important, and then to look at the contextualization of those different elements. And without this contextualization, intervention risk being rejected or ineffective, as they may not be aligned with the lived experiences, priorities, and values of the people they are intended to benefit. Parachuting any kind of intervention that will not work. And then we need really to have a buy-in. And then the buy-in indicated that we have to go through those different processes. And then the contextualization of technical intervention also within the social and cultural framework is not just a consideration, it is a necessity, absolutely necessity for the success and the sustainability of the intervention in the global south. Before an intervention, before bringing any project, we have to think of what will be the life of what we introduce after the project is finished. That's very important. That's why the contextualization is critical. And then by respecting local knowledge, involving communities in decision-making, and ensuring that interventions are culturally and socially appropriate, and then we can create solutions that are not only effective in addressing climate change and sustainability challenges, but also empower communities, promote social equity, and ensure long-term resilience. And this is not only unique for the global south, it's at the global level, even the north, we need to think of those different elements. So it's important, the contextualization, it's important to make sure that where we intervene, people have a buy-in, and then that will come only by respecting, by mobilization, and by knowing the local context. And those are some of the elements I just wanted to highlight in order to stimulate any discussion on the need for contextualization in order to be able and then to increase and then the ambition in the NDCs. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Youba. It's so excellent to hear your reflections, and especially to have the impetus for us to think about capacity mobilization rather than capacity building, because as you know, this is our capacity building program really reflects on having specific champions in lots of different parts of the world and making sure that they can then mobilize the resources within their community. So it's a really good provocation for us to think about how we're situating our capacity building interventions within the right context. And there's lots of really positive comments in the chat that this really resonates with a lot of the participants. So thank you so much for your time. Sincerely appreciate it. And just a reminder that if you have questions for Youba, you can put them in the chat, and we'll have some time after Kaya's intervention to ask those questions. So I will pass back to Myrna now to introduce
also the Francophone. Feel free, the Francophone, to ask that question in French.
Yes, please do. And yes, we had some questions in French, some comments in French as well. So thank you so much. Myrna, over to you.
Thank you so much. And now I am so excited to introduce Kaya Axelsson, the Head of Policy and Partnerships for University of Oxford. Kaya is a research fellow and Head of Policy and Partnerships at Oxford Net Zero, where she leads a team to translate research into resources, policy, and standards for defining and achieving net zero. Fingers crossed. After years working as a community organizer, Kaya moved to Oxford to work on connecting climate action communities internationally. She has earned distinction for her research on politically unlikely renewable energy coalitions. Her current research and engagement focus is on the emerging net zero governance and regulatory landscape. Kaya is an author of the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, Oxford Smith School's Guide to the Design and Delivery of Net Zero Commitments, and the most downloaded report on the Smith School's website since its publication in February of 2024. Amazing. Kaya is here to speak about climate governance and non-state actor ambition towards NDCs. Kaya, we're excited to hear from you.
Hello, thank you, Myrna. Thank you all to the youth climate training team. I am so honored to be here. This is something that I've been learning about and hearing about ever since you all started, and the global coalition that is building of youth power as a result of this program actually gives me tingles. So thank you so much, and thank you so much to all of our organizers and translators. I was asked to come here today to speak on one of my absolutely most favorite topics, which is the power that we have to drive change from above and from below. So the kind of work that we do at every level and how that intersects all the way down from the most local of policies and kind of organizational or corporate climate action, employees getting together to ask their companies to set better net zero and climate targets, all the way up to nationally determined contributions by countries. And so I'm going to go through a whirlwind tour of that work at every level, how it interacts, and what we need to do to ensure that more ambition is achieved at every level that is fair, equitable, and consultative. If we could go to the next slide, I think I have the power to move slides, but I'm not sure. I think not. So there we go. Next slide. So I know that you all probably know what a nationally determined contribution is, but I just asked ChatGPT to give me a very simple kind of wording for it, as if you would be tasked to explain it to your uncle or aunt. And it did a pretty good job. I made a few edits, as you always should. An NDC is a country's plan to fight climate change under the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. Every country must decide, and importantly has kind of the sovereign opportunity to decide how much they will reduce pollution or emissions that cause global warming. These plans explain what each country will do to mitigate climate change and protect the environment. So it's not just about emissions, although it's largely focused on emissions. And every 5 years, countries need to update their plans, which is why every 5 years we have a big COP where there's a lot of discussion and dialogue. Our next kind of 5-year checkpoint is coming up in a year. So NDCs, I think, as much as defining what something is, it's important to think about what something is not. NDCs are not actually laws at a domestic level, though they can be put into law. And so one of the things that we look at when we're looking at the credibility of a nationally determined contribution by a country is whether or not the country has put that into law and said, we stand by this as part of our legal system. NDCs are not fixed targets. Again, every 5 years we review them, and we really want them to be updated and ratcheted so that they become more ambitious over time. And NDCs, again, are not limited to emissions. Some are even represented in different metrics like gigawatts, which I'll talk about, because sometimes that can cause comparability issues. But they are often and usually represented in terms of emissions, and they often also include other metrics related to nature, energy, and resilience. And these other metrics often reflect the profile of the country that they come from. I'll go to the next slide now. Oops, too far. So, there's a really important report to assess whether globally nationally determined contributions and the policies that support them or underlie them are sufficient in terms of our global temperature goals. So we set this global goal with the Paris Agreement, and then nationally determined contributions are supposed to kind of add up to meet that goal. And you can see how with the voluntary system, that might not always be the case. You can see how a collection of nationally determined contributions, we think we can do this, might not always add up to the ambition that we need globally. And so this is a summary by Carbon Brief, which I recommend. Carbon Brief is a great resource for following nationally determined contributions. And it's a summary of the United Nations Environment Gap Report, the UNEP Gap Report, that comes out regularly. I think it's almost every year. And it looks at how current policy and current NDCs are on track or off our global temperature goals. So you can use this, the link will be in the slides, but you can use this kind of slider to see how current policy changes and how NDCs change and how far off our gap, how much of a gap we have. Right now, we do have quite a bit of a gap. Somewhere between will be somewhere between like 2 and 3 degrees with current NDCs. They get the world about halfway from the baseline to a 2-degree pathway. So there's more ambition that we really need to see from this next round of NDCs. And I'm going to talk about how no matter where you are, whether you're working with an organization within your own country, like a company, or if you're working at the international or domestic policy level, how that can help increase the ambition of an NDC. Sorry, my mouse is a little bit excited to go on to next slides. There we go. So when we're talking about climate action from above and from below, I thought it might be helpful for us to think about how they kind of relate and what the, I guess you could call the triangle of action would be. So NDCs are just the kind of contributions at the very tip of the triangle. Underneath them, you need countries to set targets, and some countries have what we call framework legislation. You might be familiar with, say, a climate change act that a country has passed that says, you know, here's all of our targets that support our NDCs across different sectors. Underneath those targets and framework legislation, what we need to ensure that the entire economy aligns to that NDC and to those targets are regulation and policy. Examples of regulation and policy I'll get into later could be a requirement that all companies in the world, or all companies in the world engaging with this country, have some kind of emissions target or emissions reporting, or climate risk and opportunity reporting. And then finally, under that, you have kind of corporate and subnational targets, meaning, you know, cities, states and regions, but also large corporations and even SMEs setting out their targets and transition plans. And as I'll discuss, there's a two-way street or an ambition loop. I think this has been touched on previously in previous talks you've had, which is great to see that, you know, others are thinking in this way as well. There's a relationship between the kind of bottom of the pyramid that has the sort of whole economy and the top of the pyramid that's setting ambition. There's a two-way relationship, which I'm going to talk about, but right now I'll kind of talk down the triangle as we go through each levels of action and how far they need to come in terms of net zero credibility. So top emitters and their NDCs, this table I thought I would just pull out sort of the top emitters around the world by country and just have a look at what an NDC might look like. Of course, when you actually get into the negotiation text, it's much more kind of complicated than that. When you look at an NDC, it's many pages long, but I thought, you know, I could just pull out some like key metrics, looking at different country profiles, vastly different population sizes and GDP sizes. Look at how their NDCs are talked about. So you see China has an aim to peak CO2 emissions before 2030 and achieve what they call carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, carbon neutrality for a country has a kind of different definition than a corporate kind of carbon neutral claim. And it would be good to look at that in the IPCC, carbon neutrality and net zero at a country level are supposed to be about the same. At a company level, they're very different terms because one relies a lot more on offsetting. Typically, carbon neutrality relies on offsetting. Be interesting to see if that's true at a country level, but typically carbon neutrality and net zero are supposed to be the same term at a country level. The United States has a 50 to 52%, a little bit of wiggle room there, reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below their 2005 levels by 2030. Now, already you can see in just comparing those two NDCs that they're written in very different ways. This makes them, for researchers and people who are trying to add them up, a little bit hard to compare. They're written intentionally in ways to reflect what the country thinks it can do. But you might have spotted a couple of things. Just thinking to yourself, or maybe in the chat, what issues do you see with the ways that NDCs are represented that could cause difficulty in comparing or even discussing which one is more ambitious or the other? Maybe you could put some of your thoughts in the chat. One of the things that I spot here that makes it a little bit difficult to compare countries' NDCs is that some of them are listing, baselines, and some of them here are not representing baselines. Usually you want to look at whether the NDC has a baseline and if those baselines shift. That's usually a first sort of loophole issue. If what we call a baseline, the base year, like below 2005 levels, if that has changed year on year, that can kind of artificially inflate or kind of overestimate how far a country has come since they set their base year. Other ways that you can have some comparability issues with NDCs are to look at the metric. So India, for example, is looking at emissions intensity. That means that India is allowing itself room to grow overall. So its total emissions can grow, but the emissions sort of per capita or per unit, in this case, it's per GDP metric. So the efficiency is getting better overall, but overall the emissions could grow. And that is kind of understandable from the perspective of a country that has an ambition to grow. But that's a very different statement from a reduction that is not based on intensity terms. And I think that this brings up an issue that you might kind of have noticed in the final two columns, that countries are very different in terms of their profile, their political context, their populations, their development journey. And so it's not always straightforward to say this country is ambitious and this country is not. You always, as with, I think, a lot of the work that you're exploring in this training, looking at context, cultural context, political context, capacity to develop green, financing to develop green. And that's a huge part of the conversation, of course, as I'm sure you're well aware during the COP process, is countries that are still developing saying, we need finance if you want us to develop green. Thank you so much for your comments in the chat about other comparability issues. Maybe that's a discussion you all can continue having. I'm going to go on to support with some resources. There are some great organizations like the Climate Action Tracker that helps us evaluate and think about NDCs. And so this is a classic resource that you can turn to. Of course, you want to do your own research and your own thinking, depending on kind of the context of the country you're looking at. But this Climate Action Tracker every year evaluates an NDC in terms of, for example, whether it's offering climate finance to other countries. So that's, we just talked about how important that is for developing countries. Countries like mine, like the US, you should always criticize your own first in a negotiation process, are not offering enough finance to others. So what they're asking others to do, especially given, how ambitious their target is perhaps insufficient according to the Climate Action Tracker's analysis. And you can read how their methodology for how they arrive at their analysis, and feel free to agree or disagree with it. You can also see that other metrics, like what I mentioned, land use and forestry, are also included, analysis of whether, the country is committing to enough on land use and forestry. You can see the target year of the target, like underlying the NDC. So the US has a net zero target, the year is 2050. And you can look at the comprehensiveness of the NDC. Does it relate to the kinds of policies in the pyramid that I was talking about? Does it talk about kind of the national framework legislation or the policies underneath that, even the regulation that you would need, or the kind of policy incentives to align the whole economy to net zero? So I really recommend this resource if you're looking at NDCs. Next, I'm going to talk about those targets and legislation that countries really need to ensure that NDCs are in fact credible. So, sometimes I think we see the graphs like the one I showed at the start, and we see that there's this huge gap between where we need to be and where we're going in terms of nationally determined contributions, but also the policies underlying them. And I want to just say that actually, it is heartening to see just how many climate laws and policies have been passed since we started this whole game. The London School of Economics does an amazing tracker of climate change legislation around the world. And these bubbles are where you can see kind of the climate change legislation and the kind of country greenhouse gas emissions data. So they're kind of correlating those things. And there's just been a huge growth in legislation on climate change. Whether or not those policies are effective or sufficient is something we'll get into. But it's not, as if no progress has been made. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the shoulders that we're standing on, all of the incredible advocates all around the world who have passed climate change laws. You can see before 1994, before kind of the COP process really got going, there were very few climate change policies around the world. And now there's over 12,000 laws and executive policies related to climate change and counting. I'm going to talk now about regulation and policy for corporate alignment of NDCs. So this is where we get into the relationship. There are different policy instruments, and these are just a very small handful of kind of sector generic, so not sector specific policies and regulations that can help align the economy to net zero by requiring that the corporations of the world disclose their emissions and disclose their climate risks and opportunities and their transition plans, and make credible claims about what they're doing. Don't make kind of false claims about, say, carbon neutrality before they've actually done the work of really reducing most of their emissions. There are product standards. There are policies that say a product has to be at a certain level or a certain standard of kind of climate alignment. Otherwise, you can't sell the product, or you kind of get a penalty. Or there are things like that are very relevant to the climate policy issue around, the sale of carbon credits that sometimes could get a carbon product standard rule around it, so that consumers are actually receiving what they are trying to buy, which is something that probably, especially in the carbon offsets or carbon credits landscape, needs a lot more regulation and policy at the moment. There are procurement requirements. So this is where governments can put their money where their mouth is, or put their money where their targets are. Governments have a huge amount of spending potential. There's something like 16 or 17% of the economy around the world that is tied to government spending. And so governments can contract firms that only meet their own net zero or climate standards. And that can help give firms around the world, companies around the world, an incentive to start aligning their own organizations to the government's own net zero goals and targets. And then there are international trade policies and laws that can help require green products of those kinds of products that are coming in across the border and those products going out. And of course, as many of you have probably already picked up on, international trade laws and policies are very sensitive from an equity perspective, because a lot of the most developed countries in the world buy a lot of things from the less developed parts of the world. And if you just tax at the border related to climate impacts without also offering dividends or financing the other direction, then that can be a penalty without the sufficient support to go green for those developing countries who are developing products. And so we need to think about all of these policies in a wider context. And that's why there's a relationship, for example, between the trade policy, the border taxes that might be put in place, and the nationally determined contribution, and how much financing that nationally determined contribution from a developed country offers to a less developed country. I'm in support of, all of these policies and regulations if designed well and with fairness and equity in mind. And this is something that we're looking at the University of Oxford, tracking the diffusion and approach to these policies around the world in every country. And what we find is that on the regulation front, the types of regulation that you just were looking at, there has been a significant increase, an 11 times increase in the last roughly 10 years, with more and more regulation each year. And this, I think, shows me something that a lot of companies around the world, when you talk to them, don't realize, is that regulation requiring them to have meaningful transition plans, requiring them to have sufficient targets if they want to get government contracts, requiring them to disclose their emissions, risks, and opportunities, and requiring them to make credible claims. These are all things that they need to be aware of because it is actually a requirement. And so a lot of countries, because regulation is fairly new, a lot of companies are unaware that regulation is coming into place, and that especially in a globalized system, even if regulation is not in place in your home country, it might affect your company if you want to sell products internationally. And so, or operate in other places, as many companies have many headquarters. And so this is something that if you're working in an organization or a company anywhere in the world in the future, and you want the company to be climate smart, you can talk to them about these regulations and say, do we have a credible net zero target or transition plan? Well, if we don't, we might not be as competitive in the future in other markets. And then finally, I'm going to talk about corporate and subnational targets and transition plans and how you evaluate those, kind of what you can look at to see what progress we've made on those. So you can look here at the Net Zero Tracker, which is a tracker we put together with many, many volunteers around the world, including many members of the Global Youth Training Program, like yourselves, have volunteered to support the development of this tracker by reading publicly available information that companies put out about their own net zero progress, targets, and plans. And so you can go to zerotracker.net if you're interested in any, for example, company around the world. We look at the Forbes 2000 list, the world's largest 2000 companies. And if you're just curious, do they have a detailed plan? So it looks like, we've assessed, or our volunteers have assessed, that Walmart has a kind of yellow light. That's it's not a detailed enough plan yet. It's not a red light. It's not that they have no plan, but their plan is not as developed or robust as we would hope it to be. Do they have a reporting mechanism? Increasingly, because of that relationship with regulation and the fact that a lot of regulation recently has come into place around reporting, we see a lot of companies, you see a whole swath of green there, have reporting mechanisms, Scope 3 coverage, carbon credits. You can look at how much companies are beginning to align to those net zero criteria that are applicable at the national level as well. And by the way, the tracker looks at other things. I'm just going to wrap up here. It's very important to acknowledge that government climate policy and business climate action has a relationship. When you get businesses to set more ambitious science-based targets, publicly update on plans, and talk about the policies they need to meet their targets, that can have a positive effect on climate policy and government. And when climate policy and government shifts to create business certainty as to where businesses should invest green, this leads to higher ambition from businesses in what we hope is a virtuous loop. And finally, I'm going to end on a story sorry, it's very excited mouse here. There we go. Does this ambition loop really work? I'm going to talk about quickly a story and a study before I wrap up. The story, here you have a picture of Christiana Figueres, who is one of the architects of the Paris Agreement. She's the woman in the middle in that photo. And the Paris Agreement, where we were able to agree even a system for countries to come together and agree their nationally determined contributions, that was a huge win, where they were also able to say 1.5 is the target, which is a very ambitious kind of temperature target at the time. Even if there's still a lot of suffering in a 1.5 degree world, there were talks at the time of creating a 2.5 or 3 degree target. And so my friends, people who I know who were working at the COP in Paris, they said that it was not until a huge number of companies came out and said, you know what, 1.5 is what we're targeting. The nationally determined contributions and negotiators felt that they had the license from the private sector to bring that target to a more ambitious place of well below 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. And that's an anecdotal story from people very close to the negotiators, but it shows how businesses have an important role to play at COP, for probably better and for worse. But in this case, that was an example of the ambition loop working, of businesses coming out and saying, we're going to hit this target, and then countries saying, if the economy can do it, so can we. Now, stories are just stories, and that's an anecdote. Whether or not it's, you know, fully true or even just part of the puzzle, you can always question. But this study that has recently come out by our research director and colleagues at LSE, Sam Finkhauser, shows that you can test this ambition loop at in every country. So they looked at countries and companies around the world, and they found that there's a statistically significant relationship between the countries that have more ambitious net zero laws and policies and targets and companies setting net zero targets. They do reinforce each other. And so that just shows that whether you work at the international level to increase the ambition of nationally determined contributions, or if you work at the corporate level to help get your company to be vocal about its net zero target and more ambitious on its net zero target, that this can have an effect both directions. And then finally, I'll just leave you with a couple of key messages and resources. Your key messages for today: current NDCs and climate laws and policies do not yet get us to our global temperature goal. However, climate laws are coming into force all around the world. Regulations who can support the alignment of the economy to net zero include many sector-specific regulations, and those we discussed, like disclosure, mandatory targets and transition plans, national procurement, and sectoral target and phase-out laws. Phase out of fossil fuels, I mean. And there's a demonstrated effect of climate advocacy from both above and below. Climate targets and laws at the national level support the development of robust action at the organizational level and vice versa. And you can operate and have an impact at any of these levels. So where do you get your information? I mentioned the Net Zero Tracker. Influence Map looks at the role that companies have to play in the political landscape. World Benchmarking Alliance looks at their progress and transition plans. And on the nationally determined contribution side, you can look at the World Resources Institute for NDCs, Carbon Brief, and the UN Emissions Gap Report, including the Climate Action Network, among many other resources, more listed at the bottom of my PowerPoint. Thank you so much. Sorry for being a little over time, and it's such an honor to be here. I hope you all have a great day and, more importantly, an amazing career in climate advocacy.
Thank you so much, Kaya. This is such an important and personal topic, especially if you try to open a bank account or something and you want to look at the bank's climate action. They really need to have a detailed net zero plan so you know whether or not you want to put your money there. And now I'll hand it over to Alexis for the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's really cool to see colleagues just put together all of their expertise in one place and for us to be able to digest that in just 20 minutes. So thank you so much. Youba, the first question is for you. Actually, Fred, we can leave the slides at the moment. Thank you so much. The first question is, what are some of the ways in which we can ensure that Indigenous knowledge is well captured in the midst of cultural barriers, for example, gender roles that might limit the voice and participation in most forums, and attempting to align to global standards that might not capture the essence of context-specific traditional knowledge?
I think it's very important and then to avoid any kind of preconceived ideas on a number of issues, because if you rely only on one aspect, one knowledge system, we have to consider the different knowledge system and then to rely on all the knowledge system. And then for sure, the conventional one, the scientific one, is captured in literature. Most of the indigenous or the so-called traditional knowledge are not captured in the conventional literature. There is a different way of doing that. And we have been confronted in the IPCC and that process. And then to say how to capture that, because they can provide some indication on how to adapt to certain aspects of climate issues. And what we did as IPCC is not conducting any research. And then what we did, we get a third party to organize a workshop and then bringing together and then some of those people, the indigenous communities, and then the local communities, and then to have a workshop based on their knowledge on numerous systems. We organized one on adaptation in Mexico, and then bringing those people from all over the world. And then we organize it also in Australia on mitigation aspect, bringing people from all over the world with United Nations University, and then they capture in a publication, and then so that they allowed us and then to bring those different elements. That can be done in any countries, and then not neglecting, and this is a way of. And then the way also of how at the local level, because if you are coming from the outside in external northern view, some have the sentiment that the women have a limited interaction on a number of issues. While if you look at the social structure, how the system is functioning, the different reality exists there. And then we have to have a way of how we'll be able to capture those systems in non-conventional way and to avoid any kind of preconceived approach.
Thank you so much, Youba. That's a really wonderful reflection on that question. Thank you. Kaya, I have a question for you. And we had so many good questions coming in. It's really hard to choose, but this one just came in recently and it caught my eye. What is being done to balance at the country level being a net sink versus a net emitter as we draft or review our NDCs? And what are the ways in which net emitters can assist net sinks, not in a way to punish, but to help sinks offset better? Love to hear your reflections on that.
This is a very politically sensitive and important question, because to sort of explain that terminology or that language, a sink is the way that we are able to, that a country is able to capture carbon dioxide from the air. And so a sink could be the incredible jungle that one country has. It has some natural sinks. And other countries who are perhaps heavy emitters might want to support the protection and even perhaps restoration of another country's sinks in order to help us meet a global balance. But of course, that can be very politically sensitive. So there's something called Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, and there's negotiations in Article 6 and Article 6.2 and Article 6.4 that specifically look at how we're able to claim different, like if one country that has a lot of emissions helps another country that has a lot of sinks increase or protect those sinks, how do we make those claims across NDCs? And then how does that interact with even companies that might be doing the same through credits? And so it's really difficult because you can imagine there are land use issues that come up around this. If one country is going to another country and helping that country protect some land, who's living on that land? How are they consulted? How are they involved in the protection and restoration of, say, that natural sink? And then who gets to claim what? Carbon Brief has done a really gorgeous piece of work, which I can share with you to send out, about the relationship between both on the private level and at the national level, countries that are paying for sinks in other countries, and how there's a little bit potentially of a colonial aspect to some of those relationships. But also you can imagine that, you know, financing for nature comes into this. And one thing that I think is really important to mention is that increasingly, because of the biodiversity COP that we have, there's an acknowledgement that we need to finance nature in its own right. So not as what you might call an offset for countries that have lots of emissions, but just because we have nature targets globally in their own right. And this comes into play here as well. I think others are probably much more expert on the topic of Article 6 and on the way that countries exchange financing in order to protect sinks while others are emitters. But I think it's important to acknowledge that, you know, the big emitters also need to bring down their emissions. We simply do not have enough natural carbon sinks around the world for countries to expect another country to mop up their carbon. That is not going to work as a strategy. The natural sinks that we already have are already strained. And so there are also ways that we can develop sinks through technology, but that can be very expensive. But those countries that are emitting a lot should probably be developing that technology as well.
Thank you so much. What a comprehensive answer to a complicated question. We have so many more questions that came through because you both sparked so many thoughts from our participants, but we also have the competing interest of lots of people wanting to get into the breakout rooms, as we've been requested each week more time for the participants to discuss with one another. So I think we'll leave the questions there, but I've put all of them in our shared community notes. And I think what might be interesting is in the breakout room sessions to talk through some of those questions together. And I'll also send them, Youba and Kaya, to you both, just so you can get a sense of what questions came up during your presentation. And if you have some time to answer them, that would be fab, but no pressure at all. Fred, if we can get the slides back up, I'll just kind of close this session and explain our next session. So thank you so much again to Carly, Youba, and Kaya for your amazing presentations and for all of your amazing advocacy and work. On the 17th of September, so on Tuesday, we have a session about youth negotiators at COP, and I'm really excited for this session. Unfortunately, I won't be able to join you all because I'll be on annual leave at that time, but I'm really looking forward to having a very interactive session where we'll have some youth negotiators walking through their experience, and the bulk of the session will be asking them any question you might have about what it means to be a negotiator, and what it means to be as part of your country's negotiating team. So really looking forward to that. And we'll also have Johnny Stengel, who's an activist, a German activist, and Marie-Claire Graf, who runs the Youth Negotiators Academy, speaking on that as well. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Oh, sorry, one back. Yeah, just as a reminder, on the 26th of September, I will send this in the follow-up email. There is a webinar that the Smith School is running on the race to accelerate renewables in the Global South. So some of our colleagues are going to be speaking on that webinar, and you're very welcome to join. That's just another event happening from the Smith School. So I'll send that out in the follow-up email. But just now, we'll say goodbye to everyone on the live stream, and we will go into our breakout rooms. So if we can hit the next slide, please. And one more, sorry. We'll go into the breakout room. So again, just as a reminder, you can pick the language that you'd like to go into the breakout rooms. And once you see